Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Janat Jalil, and I'm joined today from Cuba, from its capital Havana, by our correspondent Will Grant. And today we're focusing on growing concerns that the US may be preparing some kind of military action against Cuba. And Will, there's been a bit of a stunning development, hasn't there, in the months-long pressure campaign by the Trump administration on the communist island?
Yeah, the development is, it's certainly very significant, really, on both sides of the Florida Straits. It is the indictment of Raúl Castro over the 1996 shooting down of two US civilian light aircraft. Now, those light aircraft were being operated by a Cuban-American group called Brothers to the Rescue. They, for years, had been flying over the Florida Straits, looking for Cuban migrants, alerting the Coast Guard if those migrants were in difficulties, trying to drop supplies to them. But they'd also been dropping leaflets, propaganda leaflets, over Havana, for which they'd been warned repeatedly by the Cuban authorities that they were encroaching on Cuban airspace, violating Cuban airspace. And on this occasion in 1996, Cuban MiG fighter jets shot down two of those civilian aircraft. It has been a hugely important sort of flashpoint in US-Cuban relations during the 1990s. It essentially reset everything during the Clinton administration back to a very hostile footing. It caused the introduction of something called the Helms-Burton Act, which meant that only the US economic embargo on Cuba could only be lifted by an act of Congress, not by the president. So it sort of set everything back to a much more hostile footing. Now, Raúl Castro has been charged with murder, with conspiracy to murder US citizens, for destruction of an aircraft, and it is very, very significant. He was the Armed Forces Minister, he was the Defense Minister at the time, he was the second in command to his late brother, Fidel Castro, who was the leader of the revolution. And the idea that 30 years on, these charges would be brought against him, a 94-year-old now, and really the power behind the scenes in Cuba always has been, then it signifies a major ramping up of the pressure campaign by the Trump administration on the government of Cuba. It basically says we have, as far as they're concerned, the legal right now to seize Raúl Castro.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? That this has led to a lot of speculation that the US may be planning a similar military operation in Cuba to the one it carried out in Venezuela at the start of the year when it seized President Maduro.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the big fear, certainly from from the Cuban perspective. The government here essentially warning people to be on a war footing, to be expecting military action, and we are seeing increased military overflights of spy planes and things. I think what the concern in the government in Havana is that this will be a pretext to some form of military action, a pretext to forced political changes on the island, a reason by which Washington and the Trump administration can claim that it had every legal right in the world to force those changes, whether or not that be through troops on the ground, through some kind of action similar to what we saw in Venezuela, or some other action, that this is part of the legal framework, the legal reasoning for that. Now, that's one perspective. Of course, the other perspective is that it could simply be a negotiating position. It could simply be a way of ramping up that pressure by saying, look, this is one of the options we have on the table. Obviously, Donald Trump is known for going very far in his position to therefore create space within the negotiations whereby sometimes a more reasonable response can be reached. We don't know if that's the case here, and that is really what has not just the government in Cuba but ordinary people pretty worried.
And we know that in Venezuela, dozens of people were killed with that operation. And we know that in Iran, when the US attacked, thousands of people were killed. So in Cuba, people there must be very worried because they've already had to endure a fuel blockade that's been in place since the start of the year, imposed by the US.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that fuel blockade that has them exhausted at this point. People are more concentrated, I would say, on survival than politics. They're concentrating on making sure they have enough food, that the blackouts mean that their food doesn't go off, that their children can still go to school with something in their bellies, with something to come home to eat, that they can go to work, that they can move around the city to do, whatever it is they need to do, let alone move around the island where traffic between city and city is virtually nil these days. Operating here is incredibly difficult, yet somehow the island functions. It is a marvel, really, to the extent to which things continue to sort of limp along. But don't get me wrong, ordinary life for most Cubans is incredibly tough. Cooking with firewood, elderly parents who are going 20 hours a day with no electricity, young children. The mosquito situation is getting worse as the temperatures are rising. There's no rubbish being picked up off the streets because the state's fleet of garbage trucks are not doing their rounds because they don't have the fuel with which to do them. So people are setting fire to that rubbish, then sending up plumes of acrid smoke. It is a pretty bleak picture at its worst.
Because Cuba is talking about being open to negotiations. There's been an interview in the New York Times. Cuba's ambassador to UN says Havana does want to talk with the US. So what's the problem here? Could there be some kind of arrangement where a Delcy Rodriguez type figure emerges in Cuba, the way the vice president in Venezuela sort of took over once Nicolás Maduro was seized?
I mean, the Cuban government has always publicly said it was prepared to talk to Washington, but then it comes with a very quick caveat: as long as, there's no questions of interference in our own sovereign affairs, as long as there's no effort to change the makeup or direction of our government. And that is the difficulty, because that is precisely what Washington is trying to change here. I mean, the idea that they're basically saying, look, we'll obviously talk to you and we can put everything on the table, and we're not only prepared to do that, I think they would actually quite like to discuss, because this is critical now. But it does come with that point that, Washington cannot dictate to Cuba who runs Cuba. That is the key difficulty, because the Cuban government doesn't want the Trump administration to say Miguel Diaz-Canel can't be the president, Raúl Castro has to be removed, altogether. The Castro family can play no part in the future, etc., etc., etc. Now, that may, as you say, soften to the point that certain personnel changes can be made. So the public position is one, but the private position or the negotiating position behind the scenes is one that does allow for a Delcy Rodriguez type figure. Nobody knows who that would be. I mean, arguably nobody knew who Delcy Rodriguez would be, the figure that she has become in Venezuela as president. That is to say, sort of prepared to meet Washington's demands, prepared to change economic policy to keep Washington happy. Nobody would have really, I certainly wouldn't have expected Delcy Rodriguez to be the pragmatist that she's shown herself to be when it comes to this very, very unique moment that Venezuela is going through. There may be a Cuban official who fits that bill too, but outwardly at least this remains a pretty staunch Marxist-Leninist government with no desire to have its makeup at the very top, determined by Washington. But yes, the question of who a Cuban Delcy Rodriguez might be is one that a lot of people have been asking themselves for quite some time now.
And given that it is Cuba's state-run government that's been blamed by many for the awful state of its economy, even before the US fuel blockade, would Cubans welcome some kind of arrangement like the one in Venezuela? How has it worked out in Venezuela? Have Venezuelans themselves seen the benefit?
I think in the Cuban example, I've spoken to people who are more than ready for that to happen. People who've told me openly, I would like Trump to take control of this now, on camera, and have said, use it, which, if you followed journalism in Cuba, you'll know all too well that is a bold thing that people certainly wouldn't be prepared to say, sometimes not even in private, let alone on camera. So to have people outwardly say, I think this thing is done and it needs complete change because we are exhausted and something has to give here, and be saying not just about the government's sort of model needs perfecting and all these sort of euphemisms that used to be used, but just saying the whole thing needs to come down now, we need to build something else, is striking as somebody who used to live here for 7 years and I've done journalism here for basically 2 decades now, so I've seen people in various different moments. So it is interesting, and it is definitely the case that people, a lot of people are open to some kind of significant change that could involve kind of a version of what Venezuela's been through or going through, if, of course, it actually made ordinary life better for ordinary Cubans. And I don't know necessarily we can say the case yet whether or not the changes in Venezuela have made ordinary life better for ordinary Venezuelans. It's a little too early to say. Certainly the Trump administration is playing it up, that the money from the sales of the money from sales of Venezuelan crude will go back to the Venezuelan people in ways that they didn't in the past and so on. It's a little tricky to say whether or not that's the actual case. But look, I think people, if they felt that whatever change is coming in Cuba led to the ability to earn at a rate that was therefore reflected on the supermarket shelves, that there were products on the supermarket shelves, that they could buy, that they had purchasing power with whatever currency they're being paid in, so that, there isn't this total black market operating in dollars and euros that has no reflection with the Cuban peso, that the distortions in the economy began to ease, that they could only own maybe a couple of businesses rather than just one, they could own property. Look, things just became a little more normal, a little easier, and those who really are suffering simply want to know the lights are going to be on, there'll be enough food, their kids can go to school, they'll be looked after in their elderly care, and so on and so forth. So there are different scales of what people are looking for out of this. There may be some people hoping they can own businesses with factories and things that means of production have always been in the hands of the state, and they would like to take control of that with support from abroad, from family members in Miami or Spain. Other people have much more simple requirements, that they just want to be able to get to the end of the month knowing that they'll have enough food and enough money for the following month.
Will, it was really interesting to get your insight. Thanks very much for that. That was Will Grant, our correspondent in Havana. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, please click on the link below. Thanks for watching.